And so I'm going to suggest today that our topic of conversation is, in fact, compromise. And if we think about it, the design of the bridge was at fault. There was not enough structure, not enough undergirding, not enough stuff. I'm not an engineer, but not enough stuff to keep it stable. And as a consequence, these weaknesses in the design, when stress was applied to it, the winds coming along, matching the natural frequency of the bridge, and then what that did, it reinforced the amplitude and greater oscillations to find the bridge could not handle it anymore. So I'm suggesting that compromise is a weakness that when stress is applied, catastrophic failure may ensue. And so we're asking the question today, do you have any weaknesses in your life that subject to stress could, in fact, produce catastrophic failure in your life or somebody else's? Now, I don't know what you think of when you think of the word compromise. We, in fact, use it in several different ways. So let me clarify exactly what I want to use it tonight in addition to the full definition. If you think if Jack and Jill were caught in a compromising situation, that is emphasized, and it's usually sex, by the way, that emphasizes the act of compromise, right? And so what we're going to focus on tonight is not the act of failure as much as the not design flaws, but the weaknesses that exist not just in me or not in Josh or not in a few of us, but we all have. And we're all subject to stress and all subject to the possibility of catastrophic failure in our life. Now, I need to give a little bit of context of where we're actually been and where we're headed to sort of locate this conversation. We're in a series called The Shaping of a Leader, and we are examining the life of King David before he was ever king, as a matter of fact. And I have suggested that there is something called the quality of life quotient. Yes, I'll bring that up. And here's a picture of it. And so what's happening in the life of Israel is that they are on a long, slow decline before things will ever turn around and become better. They had this period of time where the judges were ruling over the nation. And the intention during this point in time is that God would be their king. The people weren't satisfied with the chaos that this caused. And they said, no, we want our king. So eventually God said, okay, you want a king, you get a king. And King Saul was appointed. But this, in fact, led from chaos to crisis, and things got even worse. And God inserted himself in the middle of the situation, and he called David in the middle of this crisis. Now, what happened after that? We notice there's this long decline between when David was called until he became king. So in fact, the calling of David did not actually stop the decline of the nation of Israel. It continued on. Something subtle and nuanced happened at that point. We see the decline going down faster and faster. But something subtle happened at this inflection point. David's calling, and things began to come into play that are perhaps imperceptible and not obvious to everybody, yet was slowing down the rate of decline until he would become king. And it is this period of his life that we are examining the shaping of a leader. Comment. We're not examining the shape of a leader. We're examining the shaping of a leader. In other words, we're focusing on the process which God used in David's life before him in a specific shape that came about and became king. And the reality is we all have different shapes as leaders. Some of us will lead in very explicit, upfront ways. Others serve behind the scene. The key is if we're a leader, we have influence. And so all of us have influence at some point, in some position in our life. And so we are not exempting anybody from the reality that you are, in fact, a leader in some fashion or some way. Of course, for some of us, we will rise to be political leaders. Some of us will be educators. Some of us will be great moms or great dads or great coaches. The fact and the shape of leadership changes from person to person to person. But there's a process of shaping that goes on that we're going to examine so that we might see if there's some resonance that we can take away in our own life to see how God might, in fact, be shaping us. And right smack in the middle of this story is the idea of compromise. Because the reality is, if we are leaders, we are all compromised in some way, at least in the way that I defined it. And so if we are compromised in some way, it's very, very important to understand those weaknesses so that when stress is applied, as they inevitably will be as leaders, so that we can avoid catastrophic failure in our life. So a little bit of context here. David called that he was a young boy, age 15. We talked about the David and Goliath story, which is this incredible act of faith on David's part where God unsticks. All of Israel is stuck, and it gets unstuck because of the actions of David. There's songs written about David after that turned into dances, and they basically went like this. Saul has slain his thousands. David has slain his tens of thousands. It becomes a very, very, very popular figure. Well, guess what? The current king, Saul that is, doesn't really like this fact. And so he tries to co-opt David in certain ways. He first says, I will give you money, sex, and power. I'll exempt you from all taxes because you have killed Goliath. I will offer you my daughter, which means David gets free sex. And on top of that, he gets all the power that ensues by becoming a part of the royal family. And so he has money, sex, and power. That's the offer that Saul offers at first. And it doesn't do it. It doesn't do it. So he brings him even closer into his family, and David becomes friends with Jonathan, marries one of his daughters, and he brings him to his feast, his daily, weekly feast, in order to co-opt them even further. It doesn't work. And so finally, all hell breaks loose, and Saul throws a spear at David one day and tries to kill him. And so David is on the run, and when we pick up the story now, he is probably 8.5 to 10 years on the run where Saul is trying to kill him. With the knowledge, 1, he's called to be king. 2, he's not king. He's called to be king, but he's not king. Yes, he had an initial rise where he's very popular with everybody in the nation. This caused great jealousy with Saul, but life has pretty much fallen apart over the last 8.5 to 10 years. And yes, there are moments in these 8 to 10 years where David rises to the occasion, has chances to kill Saul, but does not. And so we're picking up in chapter 27 of 1 Samuel. If you want to turn there, we'll be reading selections out of that. I'll put some of those selections on the screen. And in chapter 26, the second time that David has a second chance to kill Saul and chooses not to, and Saul realizes that David is the better man. So that's where we pick up. First Samuel 27, verse 1. But David thought to himself, one of these days I'll be destroyed by the hand of Saul. The best thing I can do is to escape to the land of the Philistines. Then Saul will give up searching for me anywhere in Israel, and I will slip out of his hand. So David and his 600 men with him left and went over to Achish, son of Maoch, king of Gath. David and his men settled in Gath with Achish. Each man had his family with him, and David had his 2 wives, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail of Carmel, the widow of Nabal. 8.5 years hauling your wives around, hauling your kids around, hauling your 600 men around, trying to protect them. The weight of leadership had begun to grind and push David down. And yes, in the midst of that, he would have moments when he would rise up and do the right, amazing thing. But the trajectory and the emotional arc that he's on is one of grinding, depression, pushing down, and he cannot take it anymore. Then David thought to himself. Now, this is a very interesting phrase because the narrator of 1 Samuel takes great pains to tell us that David is a man after God's heart. And so there are many times in the scripture, David says things, as long as the Lord lives, I will do this, or I will do that. Or there's another phrase that pops up, David draws his strength from the Lord. So the narrator uses this phrase of David's connection with God to point out to the reader that, yes, this is in fact a man after God's own heart. And so the phrase resonates with the reader when it says, but David thought to himself. In other words, he is not listening to God at this very moment. He is taking his own counsel and withdrawing in the middle of the grind and the depression and the distress that he's experiencing. He's saying, I'm going to take my own counsel right now. So all of a sudden, boop, there's a little flag that goes up on the deep soul level of David. The long-term pain and suffering has severed this relationship that he has with God in important and significant ways. But we go on. He chooses to go to the Philistines and take his family and his 600 men and their families with him. So there's probably at least 1,000 men and women there, along with the animals and the livestock necessary to feed them. This is a large outfit that heads to the capital, Gath of Philistia. Now, I don't know about you. Does Philistia, Gath ring a bell? When he killed Goliath, Goliath was what? A Philistine. And as a matter of fact, the Philistines have been making incursions into Israel, probing over and over, year after year after year. And this has been a long-term problem for Saul over many years. And in fact, one of Saul's job was to lead Israel into battle against the Philistines and to defeat them, and he had not done that. And so what is David choosing to do? On the surface, on the soul level, there's been a severance between his relationship between him and God. On the factual level, he's doing something quite ingenious, I think. He's choosing to go into the enemy camp so that Saul will forget about him, hopefully, and quit chasing them. So on the immediate, the urgency of now, he's making an ingenious move. But on a moral level, let's think about this for a second. He's ingratiating himself with his enemies that God had told Saul to defeat and conquer year after year after year. So there's three different levels in this story that we're going to take a peek at here, and that is the factual level, just the facts, what's really going on. David is ingenious as a leader, as a matter of fact, and he chooses things, a move here that's very shrewd on one hand. But what it does is it pushes him into a level of moral ambiguity. Is this an okay thing to do? Is it not? I don't know. It's not so clear. I mean, it's clearly questionable on the one hand. And then on the third level, and we can go to the next slide. I think it's on the next slide. On the third level, there's this soul level. So we're going to examine, I'm calling these things the three levels of leadership. I stole this idea from an author named Eugene Peterson. He uses slightly different language. But the basic idea is factual is immediate. It's the urgency of now. The moral is more cognitive. It's what we think and what we believe, generally speaking. And then the soul level is where we are actively engaging with God. And as a leader and as a person, as a follower of Jesus, the hope is that these three things are in congruence with each other. But the reality is when we have a weakness in our life and stress is applied to this weakness in our life and the possibility of catastrophic failure exists, these things tend not to be in congruence with each other in some fashion. And that is, in fact, exactly the case with David. Next slide. So what's going on here, one way to frame this is David is leading out of the weaknesses in his life as opposed to out of the strengths of his life or as opposed out of the soul parts of his life. He's allowing his weaknesses to drive him and to push him forward into moral ambiguity and the possibility of catastrophic failure. Okay, what's next? Students? Is for students next? Okay, so I see, I'm an educator. I teach down the street. I teach undergraduates mathematics. And so I see a little bit of this, especially in the fall semester when new students come to campus. These are students who tend to do pretty well. They're used to doing well. They're used to making good grades. And so as an educator, when I give that first exam, it's right around October 2nd, 3rd, or 4th, in Math 115, when I give this exam for the first time, they take the exam, stress is applied to their lives, and guess what happens? Weaknesses of some kind are revealed. And of course, there are mathematical deficiencies that are revealed and mathematical strengths for that matter. But something else always, always, always happens. It points to what's really going on inside. The fears, I'm futzing with the fears of the students. I'm providing some delay perhaps to some of their dreams if they didn't do so well. I'm providing some distress that impacts their desires. And those emotional sorts of things begin to pop up. And so I know that after the first exam, I need to have a big box of tissues sitting in my office because the students will come by. And I love these conversations. I do, because it gets at not just the mathematics, which of course is extremely important, by the way, but it's not nearly as important as what's happening within the heart and within the soul. And so I recall my first semester here, this is in fall of 2012, I had a woman come to my office. She made a C+ on the exam, and I'm sorry, but we challenge students in the first exam, intentionally make it a little bit more difficult, for lots of good reasons, by the way. And this was the first C+ I think she'd ever had in her life. And she says, "Oh, Professor Rolf, I don't think I continue in your class." I go, "Well," we had this conversation, but you have lots of opportunity to get better, and here's how you can get better, and da-da-da-da-da. But no, I'm going to be a journalism major, and after I graduate from here, I'm going to do this. I'm going to work for this newspaper and that newspaper, and ba-bum, ba-bum, ba-bum. And because 4 weeks into my undergraduate career, I finally made the first C+ of my life, this cannot possibly happen because it will destroy all of my plans. I realized in that conversation it wasn't about the math at all. It was about the dreams that I was poking on. Unintentionally, by the way, but the dreams that she had that I was poking on, and this weakness led to some decisions that I don't think were catastrophically failure. I don't think it was a catastrophic failure, but lead to some decisions that were probably questionable, I think, as an educator. She dropped out. She quit. Just flat quit. And of course, I see this in lots of other ways. Other students come and sit in my classes that have huge dreams. They're the first generation in their family to go to school. They come from a very small town, and they are the pride of their family and their hometown. And so they must do well because everybody is expecting them to do well. And I had a student 2 years ago sitting in my fall semester again, looking at his phone quite a bit. This is student X. Student Y came to me after class and said, "Sir, I'm a little bit concerned because I saw student X looking at his phone over and over again." And so we had a conversation ensued with student X, right? What's going on? "Oh, nothing's going on," and lots of conversations, lots of stonewall conversations with deans, etc. And finally, when we said, that we have the ability to pull your phone records, that we have that legal ability, if we need to, we really don't want, can you please, just what happened? And the dam broke. And it was about, I'm from a small hometown. My parents will throw me out if they know that I did this. I have to do well. I have to do well. Dreams delayed. I'll leave it at that. Okay. Next slide. I'm gonna skip this illustration. Let's move on. Okay. So we left off. David heads to Philistia. He makes an ingenious move on the factual level. On the moral level, it's ambiguous at best. On the soul level, it's very clear that the pain and suffering has severed his relationship, at least for now, with the God of heavens and earth. But boy, this thing worked. In verse 4, when Saul was told that David had fled to Gath, he no longer searched for him. It worked. Oh my gosh, it worked. David is an ingenious leader, as a matter of fact. And David said to Achish, the king, "If I have found favor in your eyes, let a place be assigned to me in one of your country towns, not in the capital city, far away from the capital city, as a matter of fact, that I may live there. Why would your servant live in the royal city with you? I am not worthy, King Achish." Yes, he is. He's a future king of Israel. He is an ingenious, smart leader. And so what does he do? He gets his wish. So on that day, Achish gave him Ziklag, and it's belonged to the kings of Judah ever since. David lived in the Philistine territory for a year and 4 months. So on one level, on the factual level, he is extremely successful, right? He has a plan in mind. He executes his plan. And in fact, it works. Saul is no longer chasing him, but he finds himself in moral ambiguity, and there is additional cost, as we're about to see here. Now, David and his men went up and raided the Geshurites, the Girzites, and the Amalekites. From ancient times, these people lived in the land extending to Shur in Egypt. When David attacked an area, he did not leave a man or woman alive, but took sheep and cattle, donkeys and camels and clothes. Then he returned to King Achish with a report. So if you're like me, you read all these hard-to-pronounce words, and you go, okay, those are hard-to-pronounce words. I really don't know what's going on. But here's the key. These are all tribes that were enemies of Israel. And so he has this calling as a king. His calling as a king is to lead Israel to where they are one nation, a flourishing nation, one nation under God, and they represent the kingdom of God to all the other nations. And so he finds himself in this place where he wants peace, and he has found his peace, but he is unsettled at best because he cannot escape the calling that God has in fact put on his life. And so he feels this tension. He says, I'm going to fulfill this calling, even though I'm living in this land of moral ambiguity. And so he goes out and he begins to raid the tribes that were most threatening to the nation of Israel, even though he had presented himself to the king as being, I'm on your side, King Achish, the Philistine king. So he's sort of playing both sides at once right here. And so he comes to Achish. He's a smart dude on the factual level. He's doing very well right now, but he lives in moral ambiguity. He's a very, very smart leader. And he knows, I've got to take care of my relationship with King Achish. And so he brings the plunder from these raids where he left no man or woman alive, by the way, and therefore they could not report exactly where he had been. So he goes to King Achish, says, King Achish, I'm taking care of business on your behalf. Here is some plunder. Oh. When Achish said, where did you go raiding today? Where does he say? Does he say the Geshurites, the Grizatites, the Amalekites? No, he does not say that. He says, against the Negev of Judah. Against the Negev of Jeremiel, against the Negev of the Kenites, yeah. He says, he names the enemies of the Philistines as a matter of fact. So here is David living in the land of moral ambiguity, and if we're not clear if he's behaving in the right way or the wrong way, we got even more questions right now because he is in fact being duplicitous and maybe even double-crossing King Achish. Maybe, we don't know. So on the one level, he is ingenious. On the factual, immediate, the urgency of now, he has done the things to protect his family. On the medium-term level, on the moral level, the tensions are clear in his life, and they grind, and they grind, and they grind. In fact, verse 11 says, he did not leave a man or woman alive to be brought to Gath, for he thought they might inform on us and tell this is what David really did. And such was his practice as long as he lived in the Philistine territory. It worked. Achish trusted David and said to himself, he has been so obnoxious to his people, the Israelites, that he will be my boy. He's going to be my servant for life, as a matter of fact. So, where are we? We have this long-term pain, this long-term suffering that grinds and grinds and grinds, and it begins to press on these weaknesses that are embedded in all of us and certainly embedded in David. And when stress comes up, David begins to lead forward with his weaknesses and make questionable moral decisions. But his family is protected, and relatively speaking, he has a lot of peace. He's able, apparently, to compartmentalize these tensions that clearly exist in his life and move forward. So all is well, right? All is well. Well, in those days, in chapter 28, the Philistines gathered their forces to fight against Israel. Okay, and Achish said to David, you must understand that you and your men will accompany me in the army. Oh, this is the oh crap moment. Oh my gosh. The jig is up on some levels, right? The relative peace is gone. For all of a sudden, Achish has said, you're going to be my boy, and you're going to go into battle with me because you clearly have become so obnoxious to your people that you will fight for me against your people and therefore violate the calling that God has clearly put on his life, the calling that he clearly values because he's trying to have it both ways right now. Oh my gosh. And so what does David do? He stalls. He stalls. This dude is amazing. He's so ingenious. He says nothing really. He's a great politician. Then you will see for yourself what your servant could do. You will see for yourself what your servant could do. What does that mean? It means absolutely nada. It's his way of sort of stalling. He's, oh crap, I've got to figure out something. Next slide. Jack. I got to tell you about my friend. I told you about Jack and Jill earlier. Well, my friend Jack is a real dude, actually. He's got a different name, but I got to tell you about Jack, right? So Jack grew up the son of a Pentecostal preacher here on the East Coast. And if you know anything about this Pentecostal faith tradition, it's very emotive. The way that you engage God involves your emotions. His dad was a pastor. His dad was a preacher. I've met his dad. He's a very kind, a man that I have, I think, very, very well of. But he had this propensity to tell Jack, Jack, why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? I think God may be leading you to do this or to do that. And he had a very, very strong influence in Jack's life. But the problem was Jack was not cut out to be an emotive person. He wanted to use his noggin. He had this intellectual bent to him. He wanted to understand faith from an intellectual point of view, and that was not a particularly good fit in the particular tradition that he was in, nor with a dad who was a very kind and gentle and I think godly man, but persistent man in helping Jack understand exactly what he should and shouldn't be doing. So he goes off to college. He chooses to go to a Christian college where he can explore some of these intellectual bents in his life, and he meets a woman, Jill. We'll call her Jill. He meets Jill in college, and they marry. And Ann and I know Jill. We know Jack. They're both people that we think very highly of. They make a commitment to each other and to God that they would work on their marriage every year in very specific ways. And they are also extremely committed to ministry. And so Jack and Jill move to Missouri, and they come on staff at a local church, and they are engaged in ministry in very substantial ways. Ann and I met Jack and Jill when they moved from Missouri to Colorado. And I need to give you one more piece of the story here. Jill, a godly woman, a woman I think very highly of, had a propensity to say, Jack, why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? I think we need to be doing this. And so she was an emotional dominating presence in the relationship. After he had left the family, on good terms for sure, but left a sense of a dominating father figure in his life. And so part of the reason that Jack decided to go off staff in Missouri and move to Colorado is he wanted to start over. He didn't know who he was. And this sense of, I don't know who I really am, was the weakness in his life that when stress becomes applied to it, had the possibility of resulting in catastrophic failure. He takes a job at a large consulting firm in Colorado Springs. He's working with Ann and I in ministry context. We happened to be volunteer leaders of a 20-something group at the time. His particular focus was on the married couples in our group because he is committed to marriage, and he has been for many, many years, right? He begins to get really positive feedback at work. Wow, maybe this is who I am. And his bosses give him really positive feedback. His coworkers give him really positive feedback. And one of them was, I don't know, what's a good name? Jillian, another Jill. Jill part two. And Jill part two gives him really positive feedback. I mean, I like you just the way you are. And this is a bit different from a father, a godly father, a kind father who has some strong senses of who Jack should be, and a wife who has some strong senses of who Jack should be. This is coming from Jill part two, who said, I really like you just the way you are right now. Boy, as a man, you stand a little bit taller, you walk a little bit faster, and you want to have another conversation with people that are telling you, I like you just the way you are. And so another conversation ensued. And then there was time at lunch. And so you see this weakness in Jack's life is now entered into the land of moral ambiguity. Is it okay to have lunch with Jill part two? I don't know. Maybe. Maybe not. It's not particularly clear. There's no verse in the Bible that says, thou shalt not have lunch with a person of the opposite sex. Or somebody who happened to be giving you good feedback. There's just not that verse. But clearly, a land of moral ambiguity. And then the lunch conversations have become more frequent. The conversations more personal. Just a slight touch on the hand at the end of the conversation eventually led to a kiss. And as Jack says it, he says, I knew I was in trouble. I didn't know how to get out of it. Stuck. And I would like to suggest this is exactly where we see David right now in this story. Stuck, buying time, trying to figure out how to get out. And the unfortunate news is for Jack and Jill, it ended in catastrophic failure, unfortunately. But there is this possibility that even when we find ourselves in the land of moral ambiguity and on the precipice of catastrophic failure, and even stepping into catastrophic failure, that God can meet us and move us to a new and different place in our lives. And we're about to see how this happens with David here. Oh, the Philistines gathered all their forces at Aphek, and Israel camped in the spring in Jezreel. As the Philistine rulers marched their units of hundreds of thousands against Israel, hundreds of thousands, David and his men were marching at the rear with Achish. And then what happens after this, I don't think I have it on the screen up here. Achish is very happy. He's got David's men here. David is very, very effective in war. And so David is his personal bodyguard, his bodyguard for life, as a matter of fact. Achish believes he has compromised him for life by the way he's handled him. But his other generals, Achish's generals, say, I don't know about this dude. We've heard the story, right? We've heard the dance. We've heard the song. Saul has slain his thousands, but David has slain his 10,000s, as a matter of fact. I don't know. And so they convince Achish to send him home. Now, here's a question I have. Is God at work in this? Yes? No? I don't know. It's not clear at all, right? There is no explicit statement of God inserting himself and changing the situation, as a matter of fact. And in fact, there is very little instances of this in all of David's life, of God working in miraculous, explicit ways. But what is clear in David's life is there is this inexorable pull, an inexorable trajectory from the calling to king and to beyond. In other words, David is a man after God's heart, and God will not let go of that fact. He has made him to be a man after God's own heart. He's made you to be a man and woman after God's own heart. He's made me to be a man after God's own heart, no matter what I do. And so the key is that maybe God does not insert himself explicitly, but he is under the surface, working slowly and surely to accomplish his purposes over the long haul, even if we don't see God at work in this moment, at this point, in this time. Okay. So he sends him home. The nightmare scenario is over, is it not? Chapter 30, verse 1, David and his men reach Ziklag on the third day. So they have a long, hard 3-day march back to Ziklag. Now the Amalekites, that's one of the tribes David had been hitting on, had raided the Negev and Ziklag. They had attacked Ziklag and burned it down. So the nightmare scenario, on the one hand, is over with, but another one has just begun. So we have David leading out of his weaknesses, living in this moral ambiguity. His soul has been severed. His relationship with God, his activity with God has been severed because of the long-term pain he has experienced in his life. Now, I don't know about you, but can anybody relate to maybe a possible situation in their own life? Do we have weaknesses in our own heart where long-term pain and long-term suffering and stress of any kind may lead us into the land of moral ambiguity? Do any of us maybe on the precipice of falling into catastrophic failure? Have any of us, in fact, fallen into catastrophic failure? The good news is that God is waiting to embrace us and to embrace David, as a matter of fact. Oh my gosh. And in fact, the very reason he had gone to Philistia, the very reason he had gone to Ziklag was to protect his family and to find some peace. And now Ziklag is burned and his family, as a matter of fact, is gone. They had taken captive the women and everyone else in it, both young and old. They killed none of them, but carried them off as they went on their way. When David and his men reached Ziklag, they found it destroyed by fire, and their wives and their sons and their daughters taken captive. So David and his men wept aloud. The very reason they were in Philistia is gone. They wept aloud until they had no strength left to weep. They wept aloud until they had no strength left to weep. They wept aloud until they had no strength left to weep. David's two wives had been captured, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. And David was greatly distressed because the men were talking of stoning him. Each one was bitter in spirit because his sons and his daughters. Grief turns into bitterness. Bitterness is about to step into catastrophic failure. The stoning of the future king of Israel is about to happen. And all intensity, that long-term suffering and pain, and now ratcheted up in intense ways for David. And this is what happens with pain. It has this clarifying effect. It can have this clarifying effect in our life. For some people, pain leads to bitterness, which leads to violence. For others, such as David in this moment, pain leads to something else. And deep on the soul level, something cracked open. Something broke open. And the next verse says, David found strength in the Lord his God. David found the Lord's strength. He had no other strength, right? He wept until he had no more strength. He wept aloud until he had no more strength. But now he finds his strength in the Lord because it is the Lord's strength that God has given him. Now I am reminded of the verse in 2 Corinthians, I believe. I think I have that up here. We'll come back to this in a second. Jesus said, my grace is sufficient for you because my power is made perfect in weakness. So I asked the question, do you have any weaknesses in your life? Do you have any weaknesses in your life so that when stress is applied to those weaknesses, it might lead to catastrophic failure? Jesus says, no, my grace is sufficient for my power is made perfect in weakness. And the Apostle Paul responds to this and says, therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses so that Christ's power may rest on me. And I think this is exactly what is going on here at Ziklag as the smoke goes up in the midst of the rubble. David is saying, God, I need your strength. I am a weak man right now. And God says, I give it to you in this moment. And so the word I have for this is, in fact, transparency. Maybe that's another way. Transparency, at least before God, maybe before his man. We're not sure exactly how he expressed himself, but it is crystal clear that David found his strength in the Lord. It was the Lord's strength that was given to him. And this becomes clear in the next few verses. These are the slides before. Then David said to Abiathar the priest, the son of Ahimelech. All right, he hadn't been talking to God for quite a while, at least a year and a half. And he says, I've got to talk to God. So who does he? I don't know how to do that. So let me talk to the priest because I know the priest talks to God. Okay, good start. Bring me the ephod. Abiathar brought it to him, and David inquired of the Lord, shall I pursue this raiding party? Will I overtake him? So the ephod is this garment that the priest wears. They have traditions that we probably don't adhere to, I don't think. And they basically pull off the garment, and they would throw dice to try to understand the will of God. And so this is probably, I hope it's not our tradition actually, because we have access to God in different ways. We can talk straight to God. We don't have to throw dice about it. But the point is, David is beginning to try to talk to God and try to understand on a deep soul level, what should I be doing right now? The facts demand that he go and pursue the raiding party to try to get back his family, right? But he has been living in the land of the facts and the urgent immediacy of now, and he has been living in moral ambiguity, and he doesn't want to do that anymore. He wants to live on this deep soul level where he is engaging an active God. So he says, God, what should I do? It's his basic way to do that. And the answer is pursue them. You shall certainly overtake them and succeed in the rescue. So, boy, they tear off after them. David and the 600 men with him come to the Bezor Valley where some stayed behind. They've been marching for 3 days. They are emotionally exhausted. They want to kill their king. They want to kill their leader. But in the midst of that, David connects with God on a deep soul level and begins to lead them in a new direction. And they are so exhausted that as they reach the valley of Bezor, 200 of the 600 men can't go any further. They physically cannot do it. 200 of them were too exhausted to cross the valley. But David and the other 400 continued the pursuit. They found an Egyptian in a field and brought him to David. They found an Egyptian in a field. Let's think about Egyptians. Israelites. You remember a few hundred years before, Israel had been slaves in the land of Egypt. There had been no lost blood between Egypt and Israel for a long, long, long time. And so this Egyptian boy is not somebody that you really care too much about because of the history between these two nations. And I think, though, that because of that fact, this is when it becomes crystal clear that things have been changing on a deep soul level in David. Remember, the urgent immediacy of now is to go find our wives and our children. They have left 200 people behind in the desperation that they can go find them before they're finally killed. And what do they do when they run across this Egyptian boy in a field? They gave him water to drink and food to eat. They stop. They hit the pause button. They do something that's very counterintuitive because David is leading from a deep soul level. And yes, they have this urgent, immediate need to go find their families. Of course they do. They have been living in moral ambiguity for at least a year and a half. But now, because David begins to live on this deep soul level, he sees something else. He has been given grace by the God of heaven and earth in the midst of his moral ambiguity. When he was too exhausted to even weep anymore, God gives him grace. God gives him his power in the midst of his weakness. So what does David begin to do? He begins to give grace to this boy who probably doesn't even deserve it. They hit the pause button. They stop to feed him. They give him water to drink, food to eat, part of a cake of pressed figs and 2 cakes of raisins. He ate and he was revived, for he had not eaten any food or drunk any water for 3 days and 3 nights. I don't know about you, if you're somebody that hasn't had any water or food for 3 days, you don't just take a swig of water and eat a raisin cake and I'm ready to go. It takes some time for the body to recover. And so what does David do in the fierce urgency of now? He hits pause and gives grace, for grace is not deserved, as we're about to see. David asked him, who do you belong to and where do you come from? He said, I'm an Egyptian, the slave of an Amalekite. My master abandoned me 3 days ago. We raided the Negev and some territory belonging to Judah and the Negev of Caleb, and we burned Ziklag. He was one of the raiding party who had burned down this precious, precious place for David, and David was giving him grace in the midst of this. So I asked the question, what weaknesses do you have? Because we all have them. We all have weaknesses, so that when stress is applied to our lives, the possibility of catastrophic failure exists. So I'm going to ask just a few questions that sort of come out of this as the worship team wants to come up. Can you identify these weaknesses? You have them. You have them. I have them. We all have weaknesses in our life. What are they? Maybe you can identify them. Do you find yourself in perhaps a morally ambiguous circumstance? Maybe you have experienced catastrophic failure of some kind currently or in the past. This is an opportunity for transparency and boasting about our weaknesses. And the God of heaven and earth wants to come, right now, and give grace in the midst of this weak situation, and in the midst of this morally ambiguous situation, in the midst of catastrophic failure. God loves us and wants to give grace to us right now. Some of you have experienced this. You've been followers of Jesus. You know exactly what I'm talking about. Have you experienced this grace? And so another possible question to ask is there some opportunities to give the grace that you have received from the God of heaven and earth, this Jesus, to somebody else? I'm going to give you 3 different ways as a worship band plays to respond to this. The first way is just to sit there before our God, before the maker of heaven and earth, and say, God, I'm weak, and you are strong, and I need your strength. Just you and God right there. The other way you can respond is you can come up. We have communion elements here. And when you ingest the bread, the Scripture tells us that this represents the body of Christ. It's a symbol. And if you're like me, you're a kinesthetic person. You like to touch. You like to feel. You like to think. And when you touch and when you feel and when you take this and you ingest it, you think about Jesus' body, which was broken. In the midst of that brokenness and his shed blood that's represented by our juice here, the possibility of the strength of God comes rushing into existence. The resurrection of Jesus happens. The strength and power of God that was behind that comes into the middle of the situation and becomes available to us. So you can sit there, just do business with you and God. You can come up here and symbolically take these elements. And as you do, you're saying, I choose to follow you, Jesus, anywhere that you take me. And if you're like me, I like to talk to people. So we're going to have some people after a few minutes standing here over on the side that are more than happy to talk and to go to God with you. And a chance to be transparent with you before God in whatever form or fashion that takes. Do you find yourself weary from a long, long journey? Do you find yourself with some weaknesses, maybe in a morally ambiguous place, or perhaps even in this realm of catastrophic failure? I invite you to come and respond in one of these three ways.